Hey guys, it's Coach Barreline again, coming at you with the latest installment of video lesson. Today we're going to talk about the shift in public roles of women during the progressive era and how women began to become more involved in public life, specifically in political issues. So we're going to talk about active campaigns for reforms that women are engaged in during this period. So by the late 1800s, there were more educational opportunities for women. Colleges like Oberlin College in Ohio had started enrolling women. You had a number of women's only colleges throughout the country at that time. And by about 1870, 20% of college students were women. And by 1900, a third of college students were women. Of course, now we know today that actually the majority of college students are women. And actually, I think it was last year was the first year in American history, 2011 or 2012. I can't remember specifically. It was the first year in American history where there were more women graduate students than men. So you see that certainly has progressed throughout the years. Most women who attended college at the time were either upper or middle class women and wanted to use their skills after graduation. Very few African American women, although some did attend college. People like Alberta Virginia Scott and Otelia Cromwell were notable Black American women who attended college at this time. However, employment was still restricted for most women. The AMA, for instance, wouldn't admit women until decades later. So women were barred from being doctors in many cases, arguing for getting law degrees and things of that nature. So many were denied access to the professions they chose. So oftentimes these same women would pour their knowledge and their ideas into the growing reform movement. Job opportunities, however, for educated middle class women were growing in the 1800s. By the end of the century, many views of what women were capable of and what they could do had changed, and women saw the world and the role that they wanted in their own communities. Some new workplace opportunities did include, however, teachers and nurses, which are in the traditional caring professions, but they also entered the business world: bookkeepers, typists, secretaries, shop clerks. With the growth of the telephone industry, you're going to have operators and things like that. Also, journalism is a real growth field for women during this time. Newspapers and magazines were trying to cater to this new consumer group of women that was growing as a force in the marketplace. Most working class and uneducated women took industry jobs in sweatshops and other types of factories. Generally paid less by their employers because a lot of employers reasoned that, well, if they were women, that they could be paid less because they were also being supported by fathers or husbands. Anyway, women, much like we've seen before, become really the backbone of the progressive era reform movements. Women had learned how to organize, how to persuade people, how to publicize their causes, and it also taught women that they had the power to improve their lives for themselves rather than depending on others. One of the early ways that we see the progressive movement was the child labor movement, and many women campaigned for children's rights. Lillian Wald, who founded the Henry Street Settlement in New York City, believed that the federal government had a responsibility to tend to the well-being of children. She campaigned for the creation of a federal agency to meet that goal, and she was successful in 1912 when the Federal Children's Bureau was created. Another area where you see the influence of women is in the Prohibition movement. Progressive women fought for the prohibition of alcohol in many cases because a lot of them thought that it was responsible for crime, poverty, and violence. And women saw themselves as uniquely affected by the effects of alcoholism. Domestic violence, unemployment, lack of ability for husbands to support their families. These were all things that women saw as affecting their lives intensely. So as a result, some of the most famous proponents of prohibition were women. Two major organizations led the crusade against alcohol. You had the Anti-Saloon League and, of course, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was headed by Frances Willard. Powerful force both for temperance and for women's rights. And you also had evangelists like Billy Sunday, who, a male evangelist that was very popular during the time frame. And, Carrie Nation, Garrett County from our own neck of the woods, who preached against alcohol, and she would take her hatchet into saloons and smash up saloons with the hatchet while she preached and spoke scriptures and things of that nature. She actually even sold little buttons of hatchets to help raise money to fund her travels and her events. Eventually, the pressure is going to grow so great that Congress proposed the 18th Amendment in 1917, ratified in 1919 by the states, and immediately proves to be a public policy disaster, as it actually increases alcohol consumption and really helps create organized crime in the United States, or at least helps it skyrocket to great heights unseen before. African American women are also fighting for reforms during this time. The most notable group is the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. Some of the more prominent women of the time was Ida B. Wells Barnett and Margaret Murray Washington of the Tuskegee Institute, and of course Harriet Tubman, the famous Underground Railroad conductor. One of their main focuses as an organization was the campaign against poverty and segregation, but even more so against lynching. Lynching was one of the main focuses of their advocacy, to try to end lynching as a practice in the South and try to get a federal amendment to end it. The women's suffrage movement actually kind of rises out of some of these other reform movements that we've talked about before in U.S. history. After the Civil War, many suffragists who had been abolitionists called for granting the women to vote, but were told they should wait till after the war, or should wait until later. Many were angry. The 15th Amendment had given voting rights to former slaves, but not to women. And the women wound up organizing into two main groups. The first is the National Woman Suffrage Association, founded by great friends Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And this campaigned for a constitutional amendment allowing women to vote. And it also dealt with other women's issues like labor reform and other issues, and actually supported the first female candidate for president, Victoria Woodhull. The other organization was the American Woman Suffrage Association, which was led by Henry Ward Beecher as the president. This focused solely on the state-by-state ballot initiatives, trying to win women the right to vote state by state. And it aligned itself very closely with the Republican Party. The first place that women see success is in the West, and it makes sense. On the frontier, the divisions of labor between men and women are going to be much less. So, and therefore, the social divisions oftentimes are less stringent as well. So, in 1869, the Wyoming Territory granted women the vote. The Utah Territory followed a year later, and 5 more Western states fell in line not long after that. So the West is going to be an early place where we see some successes for the women's suffrage movement. Of course, Susan B. Anthony is probably the most famous suffragist, I guess I should say. She wrote pamphlets, made speeches, testified before Congress, and in 1872, she's actually one of the first women to go to jail for registering to vote. She actually goes and registers with her sisters in Rochester, New York, and is allowed to register. It's not until 2 weeks later that the police come to her home and arrest her. Anthony spoke passionately about women's voting rights. However, the judge refused to let her testify on her own behalf and fined her $100. She refuses to pay the fine and hoped to be arrested so she could be tried through the courts, but she was not in prison. The judge chose to not send her to jail. In 1873, the Supreme Court strengthened the anti-suffrage case by saying that even though women were citizens, that didn't automatically grant them voting rights, and that therefore it was up to states to grant or withhold that right. Some popular arguments you had. First, you had some social arguments that opponents of suffrage made. Some believed that women were just too frail and fragile to handle the turmoil of public polling places. Some believed that voting would interfere with their womanly duties at home or destroy families. Women must be so worried about voting that they wouldn't, be able to cook and clean and take care of the children. Some also claimed that women didn't have the educational experience to be competent voters. Never mind the fact that the vast majority of men at the time were still illiterate. And others believed that most women just didn't want to vote, that it was unfair for a small minority of vocal women to force that responsibility onto other women. Economically, you had strange bedfellows develop. The liquor industry feared that giving women the vote would lead to prohibition. So as women became active in other reform movements, business owners also feared that women would vote for government regulations of business that would drive up costs. Churches and clergy members preached that marriage was a sacred bond and that the man, as the head of the family, voted for the family. So you have this kind of strange bedfellows of the liquor industry, religious fundamentalists, and big business interests that were kind of working together to limit, to prevent women's suffrage. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association merged to join the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA as it is commonly known. NAWSA operated under the leadership of Stanton, and Anthony was also as president from 1892 to 1900. Anthony died in 1906, and her final words, failure is impossible. And even though she died 14 years before women finally win the vote, it does show her determination, and it does kind of give a rallying cry to the suffrage movement moving forward. Like I said just a second ago, most early suffragists did not live long enough to cast their ballots. When the women finally won the vote in 1920, only one member of the original Seneca Falls Declaration from 1848 was still alive, and that was Charlotte Woodward, a glove maker. And she was the only surviving delegate from the Seneca Falls Convention to actually cast her vote, or that was still alive in 1920. So, basically you have women becoming increasingly more active, and we'll talk about how the suffrage movement changes and evolves over the years later on. But what you see is women becoming increasingly more involved and pushing against the restrictions, the societal restrictions that many have faced in American society up until this point, and they're starting to redefine what it means to be a woman in America. And of course, when we talk about World War I, we'll see how that is going to also help dramatically change public views of women. So until then, we'll talk to you next time when we're talking about Roosevelt and his progressivism. We'll talk to you later. Bye.